Hello, everyone. My name is Simon, and I'm a volunteer and host from Australia-Hong Kong link today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar co-hosted by our organization, WLW Immigration Lawyers and Haven Assistance. Australia-Hong Kong link is a network of volunteers that support and promote human rights and the democratic movement in Hong Kong. We also provide support to Hong Kongers in Australia. The webinar today will focus on two topics: the protection visa application process in Australia and the recent changes to visa arrangements for Hong Kong passport holders. I will turn to introduce the presenters from the topic tonight in a moment. But first, let me begin by acknowledging that I'm working today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm sure many of you are aware that the Australian government has recently implemented new visa arrangements for people from Hong Kong. With the crackdown in Hong Kong and members of the Five Eyes countries relaxing visa requirements in Hong Kong, many of you may be considering options in Australia. So to help us understand the issues and to provide clear and reliable information, let me acknowledge and welcome our friends of Haven Assistance and WLW Immigration Lawyers today. We have Simon Chung from Haven Assistance. Many of you will be familiar with him. Mr. Chung is an ex-British consulate staffer in Hong Kong who was detained by the CCP authorities when he attempted to return from a business trip in Shenzhen in August last year. He was recently granted asylum by the UK government in July following the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong. Alongside other exile activists, Mr. Chung co-founded the Haven Assistance program, an online platform that aims to provide case-by-case immigration and asylum claim advice to Hong Kongers. It is also a pleasure to welcome Mr. James Wardlaw and Ms. Rabiah Khawaja from WLW Migration Lawyers today. James is a specialist in migration law and a co-founder of the WLW Migration Lawyers. He has worked as a lawyer at Victorian Legal Aid and the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre in Melbourne. James presented at the 2017 National Annual Migration Law Conference on the future of migration lawyers in Australia, and he has been a finalist twice for the Law Institute of Victoria Rising Star Award in 2015 and then in 2019. Rabiah is a solicitor and registered migration agent. She joined WLW Migration Lawyers in 2017. Prior to her career as a lawyer, Rabiah worked as an immigration officer with the New Zealand government's Ministry of Business, Employment and Innovation for 6 years. She is a member of the Victorian Women Lawyers and is a committee member of the Cultural Diversity Committee. Pleasure to have you all today. I will now hand over to Simon, and he's going to give a brief introduction about Haven Assistance and the aims of their organization.
Well, thanks, Simon, and thanks. This is the first time that we can co-organize and collaborate with our Australian partner. And actually, Haven Assistance have been set up for about 2 months, and that's the first time we try to reach out to the activists in exiles, for example, me from UK and Ray Wong from Germany, and also Lum Wengate from Taiwan and Brian Learn from the States. We wanted to set up the information sharing platform to provide a very basic and public information of the assignment. So we also, for example, Ray and May, we have a first-hand experience to apply and have been granted political asylum either in the UK and Germany. So we think that at least it would be a much more reliable platform. Usually we set up the Proctor Mail and Facebook page, and that's the people that they can drop us a message. And we will have Telegram, we will have Proctor Mail to talk more about the case. Although that we advise, they're not telling us more personal information for their own safety. So we will be quite low profile, to be honest, because that's we would deal with the case by case and to give them some our own advice to let them to make decisions based on their cases. But meanwhile, we also would provide some, updates. For example, in the UK, we will see the BNO visa scheme, etc. So that is the intention why we want to set up, is because usually we would know those people that if they wanted to leave Hong Kong and then they would connect with their mutual friends, and which is not totally safe. And that if we feel that if they have no network, they can ask us. We would be like a gatekeeper or receptionist, and we'll personally refer to a legal organization to provide legal support, mental health support, etc., etc. So that's kind of things we're running about several months. And we're also scheduling, we will have a series of broadcasts, including this one, and this week will be Australia, and the following weeks would be the UK, Germany, United States, Canada, etc. So we wanted to give a more comprehensive picture to those people to see, like the asylum policy or which way that they can go. So yeah, that is our intention, and thanks for your invitation now.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I'm sure a lot of people in Hong Kong will find that very useful given the times that we're in. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to James and Rabiah for their very informative presentation today.
Everybody, and thank you for the very kind introduction and words, and certainly for Rabiah and myself, we feel humbled to be invited tonight and to be a part of the organisation, and also supporting the Hong Kong community here, mainly in Melbourne, but also throughout Australia. And it's a real pleasure for us to be able to present to you tonight and work through some of the changes that have happened in Australia and some of the recent announcements by the Australian government, as well as talk about the different visas available in Australia and the framework we currently have to deal with. Obviously, this space is evolving and evolving quickly, and I think a lot of governments throughout the world are still in the process of planning and delivering options for Hong Kong nationals in light of what is happening in Hong Kong. So I suspect that what we talk about tonight may very well be redundant in the months to come, but it's an important start, I think, to generate a cohesive and responsive network so that we can share information like this, not only just in Australia, but throughout the world. So thank you again for having us. As Simon mentioned, I'm a migration agent and a solicitor in Australia. I'm also an accredited specialist in immigration law. In Australia, you must be a migration agent to provide and deliver migration or immigration assistance. Many people who are in Australia currently will have their own agent and their own solicitor, and that's great. It's really important that if you are working with somebody on your immigration matter, that they are a registered migration agent, and you can check that by looking their details up at the Office of Migration Agent Registration Authority. And if you are using a solicitor, that's fine. And there is a distinction in Australia that migration agents are one organisation, and then there is solicitors as well in Australia. So we are both. And I have personally been doing migration law for quite a long time now at various different organisations, including some NGOs in Melbourne and legal aid here as well. And primarily my focus certainly over the last 8 years has been on protection visas, so I can provide a fairly comprehensive insight into protection visas. And Rabiah is one of our associates at WLW Migration Lawyers and has been with us for a number of years, and also has a very in-depth experience in protection visas in Australia. Rabiah also works with a lot of our domestic violence victims and in other areas, other pro bono areas the firm works in. So Rabiah, maybe perhaps you can give a bit of a rundown on the types of work that you're doing at the moment.
Sure. Thank you, James. And just resonating what James has said, we're pretty humbled to be part of this webinar and assist the Hong Kong link with providing education and information to a lot of the Hong Kongers out there that are in need of it at the moment. So I've been with WLW for about 4 years now, and I've been practicing as a solicitor and migration agent for 3 years, coming up to 3 years now. And I deal with, I've got a lot of experience doing protection visas, and of recently assisting a lot of Hong Kongers with their protection visa applications as well. I deal with a lot of domestic violence victims and a range of other skilled or student visas and appeals within the firm. So I kind of have dipped my hand in a lot of areas. So hopefully I'll be able to provide you guys with some good information tonight.
Great, thanks, Rabiah. So a little bit about our firm. So the firm is now moving on to being 5 years old, so we're still relatively new, but the solicitors within the firm have many years of experience in immigration law. Since the firm started, we've managed to, well, we're lucky to win various different awards, including an award for our Bridge project, which was designed at providing pro bono assistance to various different migrant groups within Australia, as well as low cost fixed fee models, which breaks the mold a little bit when it comes to working with lawyers. We work in all visa areas, so we'll be able to provide a broad range of information tonight about all the different visa subclasses in Australia. We also work a lot in the tribunal, merits reviewing tribunal visa decisions, as well as litigation in the court system in Australia. And we generally operate on a fixed fee based model, and we have a lot of great reviews. So that's really a testament to our clients that we work with, that we enjoy working with, and they've been kind enough to review our work favourably. So tonight, what we'll be covering is an introduction into the Australian visa program. I think it's a good point to start to explain how the visa program works in Australia, and this will be very different. I understand this will be available to people throughout the world. It's important to check wherever you are the laws that apply to the country that you're residing in. Tonight we'll be focused on the Australian visa framework, and will operate, I imagine, very differently to the framework in other countries such as Germany, UK, and other places. So tonight specifically about Australia's program. We'll also cover the recent changes that the Australian government has announced to make it, in the interim, I guess, more flexible for those people who are in Australia currently, as well as prospective visa applicants coming to Australia. So it's good to understand what changes have been made, and as we'll see tonight, there's still a little bit of work to do there, and I expect there'll be further announcements to come from the Australian government. From there, we'll then launch straight into protection visas. I think this is one of the key areas that most people want to know about. Protection visas in Australia are how we give effect to the Refugee Convention, and every country deals with protection in a different way. And in Australia, it's codified under the Migration Act. So there's a very specific set of criteria you need to meet in order to secure a protection visa. And we're going to go through that tonight, as well as talk about some of the tips and tricks and challenges that we expect that particularly Hong Kong applicants may face going through this process. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions, and we'll go through those as well. So I might hand over to Rabiah just to give us an overview of the Australia's immigration framework.
Thank you, James. So Australia offers a range and variety of different visa subclasses, provided that the individual who's applying meets the eligibility requirements. We have the most popular ones, or the most ones that are tend to be frequently applied for are student and temporary visas. Temporary visas can range from visitor visas to business visas. You've got a number of skilled visa options as well, where they can be either permanent residency or they can be employer nominated visas, where you have an employer that's willing to sponsor you on a work visa, which also may lead to a permanent residency visa pathway as well. There's a number of family visas as well, which where the Australian government does recognise that Australia is a multicultural country, and you're going to have a number of family members overseas, and so uniting them in one way or another is one of the aspects that they do recognise. So you've got family visas, which are partner visas, parent visas, child visas, which whilst they do take a long time, the main thing is that the government is offering those. And then you also have the humanitarian visas, which largely fall onto onshore protection visas. They do offer a global humanitarian offshore visa. However, in our experience, it is often difficult to apply for that, as the quota that the Australian government has for each year is often quite small. So it is difficult to get, but they do offer the onshore protection visas.
And I think one thing to add there is that there's over 100 visas, subclasses in Australia, and they can be complicated. Each visa has their own set of criteria, and we've briefly spoken about some of the more popular ones, but there are a lot of visas that are available. The key thing I guess you need to be aware of is that you must have a visa to enter and reside in Australia. So that's really important. And currently at the moment, one thing just to flag is that Australia currently has a very strict travel restriction in place because of COVID-19. And not only do you need to hold a visa to enter and reside here, but you also need to have a separate permission to travel to Australia or be exempt from that restriction. And that is also changing week to week, it seems. So something to just be aware of.
And so the Australian government has taken a very positive step towards a response of the political unrest that has occurred over the last year now in Hong Kong, to assist Hong Kongers that are in Australia at the moment, or possibly in the future may be intending to come to Australia, pending the border restrictions are lifted. So this is on the basis of Australia and Hong Kong's relationship, and it has existed for a while, a strong relationship between Hong Kong and Australia. And they've provided a visa pathway for those Hong Kongers that are seeking a safe haven in Australia at the moment due to their inability to return to Hong Kong based on the political unrest that's occurring.
I think another thing to add there is that although at the moment we see the current changes and the proposed changes that were announced by the Prime Minister to be positive changes, there's still work to be done, and there's still a lot that's unclear, and it's not until people, I think, understand and have that clarity as to how they can apply for a permanent visa and what that pathway looks like, that it will be a framework that I guess works to everyone's advantage. So I expect there will be further announcements to come, and as we go through tonight, you'll see that there's still a lot of areas that are left either blank or unclear. So that's something I think for the government to continue to focus on. So we thought we'd start with protection visas because they are the hot topic. So in Australia, well, the starting point is Australia is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and the way Australia gives effect to that convention and those obligations not to send someone back to their country where they may be harmed or persecuted is there is a subclass of visa which is a protection visa. And generally speaking, you can lodge an application for a protection visa whilst you're in the country, and no matter what visa you hold, or if you don't hold any visa at all, it is still possible to apply for a protection visa. So there is a lot of flexibility around who can apply for a protection visa whilst in Australia. Now, I should say that it's really important. One of the key messages tonight is that everybody who is intending on applying for a specific visa in Australia, and more so if it's a protection visa, you must get independent advice about your own circumstances, because there are many different things that could impact your future and your pathway, and there will be things, pros and cons and risks and benefits that you'll need to take into account before you decide to lodge any application for a visa. So tonight is not designed to be legal advice. It is general information. So you need to be very careful about that and seek independent advice before you make any application. So having said that, a protection visa, the main criteria for it is that you need to either be meet the definition of a refugee under the Migration Act in Australia, or you need to meet what we call the complementary protection provisions. And to simplify it, essentially what you need to demonstrate is that you would be at risk of serious, or there's a real chance that you would be at risk of serious or significant harm if you were to return to Hong Kong. And the definition gets broken down in a bit more detail, in that if you were to seek to meet the definition of a refugee, you need to prove that the reason that you would be harmed in Australia is because of your race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or your political opinion. And it's really that last one that I think will be most poignant here, which is that people may be seeking protection because they will be harmed because of their political opinion. Now, the political opinion might be one that someone actually holds. So it might be that they genuinely, believe in a pro-democratic system and against the CCP, and that is an actual opinion. Or it might be that you fear harm because you think the authorities in Hong Kong may think that you're pro-democratic, and that's called an imputed political opinion. And both of those may meet the definition of a refugee. Now, you also need to prove that you would be at a real chance of harm. Now, a real chance means that it's not remote. So there is a complex legal consideration of what real chance means, and it can mean less than 50%. It can be as little as 10% chance of being harmed. What is important is it's not remote, and really the way you establish that you are at a risk of harm, or you're at a real chance of harm, is by explaining to the Department of Immigration or the Tribunal, depending on which stage you are at, in very clear terms why you think you would be harmed, and demonstrating the evidence for establishing that, as well as relying on country information and independent reports about what is happening in Hong Kong to people of similar profiles. And the Department of Immigration will then evaluate what they think is happening in Hong Kong, and based on all the information that's available that you must provide. So the onus is on you as the applicant to provide the evidence and the basis for why you believe you're at risk of harm, and then they will make a decision based on all of that. So That's the other thing you would need to prove would be that the state can't protect you from that harm. But in this case, I'm not sure that's too much of going to be an issue, because it is the state and the authorities that people fear. You also need to prove that there's not a safe part of Hong Kong that you can go to in order to avoid that harm. So, which again, I don't think is going to be an overly difficult thing to prove if you can establish that you would be at risk in Hong Kong. So that's a very brief overview of the definition of a refugee. Complementary protection just, I guess, encapsulates people who might not be able to draw the link between why they fear harm. So it might be that they are at risk of harm. It's just not because of the 5 reasons under the Refugee Convention, political opinion and membership of a social group, and etc. So with complementary protection, it's a much more straightforward definition under the Migration Act, which is that you simply are at a real chance of harm if you were to return. So that's a very brief rundown into the criteria for a protection visa. There are other criteria, and it's important, again, that you seek independent advice about whether or not you personally are someone who meets that definition, and really what the Department of Immigration is going to be looking at in great detail is your individual profile. Now, people have, and the reason that's important is that some people have actively demonstrated in Hong Kong and have subsequently travelled back to Australia. Some people have been active on Facebook and other platforms demonstrating their political opinion, and that's important. Some people have not done either of those things but are concerned about their safety if they go back for one reason or another. Now, no one case is the same. So when I get asked from people, what's your success rate with protection visas and how many Hong Kong people have been granted protection, you can't answer those questions because the success rate is irrelevant. It's more about you as an individual and whether you meet that criteria for protection. So that's why we stress that it's very important to seek independent advice from a lawyer about whether you can meet that definition. So I might hand over to Rabiah to talk a little bit about how you might prepare an application for a protection visa and what you should expect if you're working with your lawyer or your migration agent. Some of the things that we do in preparing a protection visa application.
Thanks, James. So just bouncing off what James has said about getting independent advice, it also is really important when preparing an application for protection, because a lot of people think that it's just submitting a form and that's it. That's all you really need to do. You pay a nominal fee. However, if you want a good chance at the department considering an application, it's a bit more in depth than just filling out a form and putting forward a couple of sentences about your claims. So when we engage with a client to organise or submit an application on their behalf, we submit the very long form that usually includes a lot of information about their background, biodata, dates, education, employment. Credibility is also something that the department will assess you on, meaning how truthful your claims are or how truthful the information you've put forward is. So it's really important that you provide the correct information on the form, because yes, you might have an opportunity to correct that information at a later stage. However, it may also jeopardize your credibility about the information that you're putting forward. So we work through the forms with clients, and then we also assist in drafting a statement of claims. So bouncing off what James has said, going through the criteria for a protection application and how the department will assess you, and we will draft a statutory declaration with the client, going through the background, their claims either back in Hong Kong or in Australia, and outlining in a lot of depth about what actually has taken place. It's probably not enough or substantial enough to provide a brief, a a brief outlook into what has happened. It's more about how much details can you actually provide about what your fears are, what your beliefs are, how this happened, when it happened, who it happened by, who you fear, and why the state can't protect you, even though it's evident, and you might think that it's quite obvious that the state can't protect you. It's about putting those claims that the state can't protect you and why they can't protect you, and also why you can't relocate to another area in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's quite small, which is what I've learnt over the last couple of months, and so it is difficult for anyone who is in that position to relocate, because either the authorities might find them or it's just not even possible. A lot of people who have been demonstrators in Hong Kong, they have been either charged or they've been questioned by the police. And while it's good to put forward those claims, and it's important to put forward those claims, having evidence to back up any of the claims that you're putting forward, that you've either been to the police station or you've been charged or you've got a court order against you, all of that is actually really, really important in putting forward for your protection application, because that provides evidence of what you're saying in your claims.
I would just say, just on that point, that before you do submit any documents that support your claims, you need to speak to a lawyer first about whether or not it may jeopardise your case. But what Rabiah is saying is absolutely critical, that that generally speaking, having any documents that support what you're saying will go a long way to helping the department believe that what you've said is true.
We can go to the next slide. No.
Yeah.
Cool. So a lot of the issues that I guess, wouldn't say the implications mostly for applying for protection, which often clients that come to us aren't aware of, which is why, again, it's really important to get independent legal advice before going forward with the protection pathway, just because there's a number of issues that individuals need to be aware of prior to applying for protection. And one is the eligibility for other visa pathways. Because a protection visa onshore is a permanent protection visa, it may, once you've applied, it may hinder an individual's ability to apply for a temporary visa, because a temporary visa initially, briefly, means that you intend to stay temporarily in Australia. However, if you've applied for protection, it indicates that you're wanting to permanently reside in Australia, which may then hinder someone's ability to apply for other visa pathways where a temporary stay is a requirement in Australia. Also, another issue that comes with applying for protection is the individual's inability to return to their home country. So in this case, it would be Hong Kong or China, possibly. If you fear harm from or in a particular country, if you are granted protection, it's on the basis that you are unable to go back to that country. So if in the event you're granted protection and you return, the department may view it as you actually don't fear harm in that country as per se. Is that, just to confirm, James, that's correct?
Yeah, so there is a condition on protection visas when you hold them that you not return to the country you've been granted protection from. And look, I mean, the world changes and things politically change, and no one can predict the future. But it is important to understand that whilst you hold that protection visa, returning could give rise to the department to consider cancelling your visa on the basis that you've breached visa conditions, which is not to return. People generally, once they hold a protection visa for at least 12 months and meet the citizenship test, will generally seek to apply for citizenship in Australia. And once you become an Australian citizen, then that condition to not return ceases. But it certainly is not a good look where you've been granted citizenship and then immediately return to the country that you sought protection from. So it's just something that you really want to keep in mind. Now, look, as I say, the situation may change. Look, who knows? People more knowledgeable than myself would be able to make comment on whether it may change for the better, but it is just something to keep in mind when you make that application for protection, because it is quite a prohibitive condition.
Cool. Thanks, James. Another issue is a lot of Hong Kongers are also British national passport holders. So they don't hold citizenship, but they hold a right of entry subject to meeting immigration clearance to the UK. Under Australian law, it's a bit technical, so I'll just cover it briefly. If an individual has a right of entry to another country, whether it's temporary or it's permanent, the department may view it as your ability to seek protection in that country. However, at the moment, policy specifies that you have to have the right to do that. In our opinion, because British national passport holders are still subject to meeting immigration clearance, they don't technically have that direct right of entry. However, it may be an issue that the department questions that individual about, and the individual would need to put forward claims about their inability to travel to the UK or reside in the UK even on a temporary basis, and the difficulties that they would have in entering the UK. But it's an important, because a lot of Hong Kongers have British national passports. It's an important aspect to note when applying for protection, and it's important to note when they put forward a statement to cover that off, because most likely they will be asked about this in their protection visa interview. Once an individual's applied for a protection visa, they are also granted an associated bridging visa, which will most commonly, if they're currently on a substantive visa, they would get a bridging visa A, which would usually, not always, but usually it comes with no conditions, meaning that individual is able to work and study in Australia while their protection visa is being processed. Another really important aspect is that the protection visa process is not short. It's very long. It can be very, very long. And thanks to COVID, it's probably going to be a bit longer now. It could go on for 2 or 3 years before someone's invited to an interview even. And even after that, post-interview, it may take another 6 months for a decision. And then, you're looking at around 2 to 4 years, possibly at the department stage, before you're actually able to get any kind of indication whether the department is satisfied with your claims and wanting to kind of grant you a visa in the end.
I think that's a good point, Rabiah, and I've been asked a lot, what is the success rate of Hong Kong protection visa applicants? And I have to say to those individuals, well, ask me in 2022 or 2023, because that's when we'll get the decisions. So I think it's important to understand that at this stage there have been no decisions made, as far as we're aware, for the recent cohort of Hong Kong applicants. So success rates won't be anything to go by really for another 2-3 years. So that's, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but getting independent advice about your case and whether you meet that definition is probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah, most definitely. And usually, one of the main issues that we do come across with the long processing times is that if you apply for protection now, your claims will be assessed in 2 or 3 years. And at that point, the department will ask you what your fear is of going to Hong Kong is. Why can't you return now? It's been 2 or 3 years that the situation has happened. We don't know if the situation in Hong Kong will change. A lot of people told me no way. However, we never know which way the world might go. So it's just really important for everyone to know that it does take some time, and at the moment there's no indication that they're going to streamline or prioritise these kind of applications. However, we hope so, that the Australian government kind of ends up doing that, but at the moment it's going to take some time. And a lot of a lot of individuals have asked about getting their family members over or when they could sponsor their family members. And again, you're looking at 3 to 5 years in the future before that may be a possibility should the individual be granted protection.
One other thing I just want to add with this is deciding whether or not to apply for a protection visa in Australia is it's a complex process. You need to evaluate, one, what your chances of success might be based on your own case. And then you also need to evaluate what your chances of success might be to secure other visas. So you might be able to get a permanent visa of a different subclass more easily than by applying for a protection visa. So it's not as easy as just going, oh, okay, I can apply for protection and I will get it. It's a matter of evaluating all your visa options and then going, well, what is the best, simplest, and in most cases, what is the cheapest way to permanent residency? And I think one thing Rabiah and I can say with some confidence is that applying for protection is stressful because it's the one visa that is very hard to give advice about whether or not it would be successful or not. We can give a range and maybe say if it's a good or high or not so good chance, but often a lot depends on how the delegate, when you get in that interview, how the delegate from the Department of Immigration sees your case and evaluates all the evidence, including the way you give your answers in that interview. So yeah, again, looking at all your visa options is really important.
Can I ask a question? And if those Hong Kongers has a BNO passport, if that has any preferential treatment or if that has any advantage as a Commonwealth citizens in Australia?
No direct advantage.
Okay.
So my understanding is that there's an advantage when it comes to the UK, but in Australia, no, it's not recognised or preferenced in any way.
I see. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. But I think from what Rabiah said, it is a really good point that if you have a legally enforceable right to enter into another country where you're safe, then you may not meet the definition of a refugee. So understanding that before you apply is really important. Australian government recently announced some changes to the broader migration framework in Australia to, I guess, provide more flexibility to Hong Kongers, and that's because there are many Hong Kongers here that are typically on either student visas, graduate skilled visas, which is the visa that you get typically after a student visa if you've completed a bachelor level or a certain course, and then there's also a number of Hong Kongers here on what's called temporary skilled shortage visas or employee sponsored visas. You might have heard of 457s or 482s. And so there's a large number of Hong Kongers on those types of visas. So the government's really honed in on those and tried to provide some greater flexibility for those visa holders to, I guess, provide some temporary relief to some of the concerns in returning to Hong Kong. And in the statement that has been made, there's been reference to permanent pathways, but they haven't yet been defined in any great detail. So what we're going to go through tonight is just some of the changes that have been made that we know about, and then flag some of the things to look out for moving forward.
So one of the main responses or the main visa pathways that the Australian government has implemented is for the Hong Kong students or Hong Kong passport holders. Mostly for many of the students that are currently studying at universities or doing tertiary education are able to apply for what we call a subclass 485 graduate skilled visa after they've completed their studies. That's provided they meet the other eligibility requirements for a 485 visa. Specifically for Hong Kong passport holders, the department has introduced a 5-year graduate skilled visa, meaning that they will, as long as they are a Hong Kong passport holder and able to provide evidence of that, once they apply after they've completed their studies for a 485 visa, they will be granted a 5-year graduate school visa. So usually in the 485 category, you'd be granted a 2-year visa or a 4-year visa possibly. However, for Hong Kongers, it will be a 5-year visa.
That's right. And the other thing just to note there is, I mean, if we had many hours, we could go through lots of different things. But one, I think, issue that is on everyone's mind is for students who are currently stuck outside of Australia, that weren't able to get back to Australia before COVID and the travel restrictions were implemented. The government is working on some greater flexibility around completing online study to complete courses remotely and still be eligible for some of these visas. So I won't go through it tonight, but definitely keep an eye on the Department of Immigration's website, and there's a specific COVID section that talks about some of the changes that have been implemented and might be implemented soon to at least allow some greater flexibility there for people who have been stuck outside. So one thing that is unclear is in the statement, the department did make reference to permanent pathways while sort of after the 5-year period on the 485 visa, which is the graduate skilled visa. What's not clear is what subclass of visa that is and how that's going to operate, or whether it's expected that people will just have to simply use the current framework that we have and the visas that are available. So generally speaking, when you're not talking about protection visas, but talking about other types of visas, the most common permanent visas that people pursue are probably the independent skilled visas, which are the ones where you need to have a certain number of points for, and it's a competitive process. You go in a pool of people and put in expression of interest, and if you've got enough points and in a particular occupation, then you might get an invitation from the government to apply for an independent skilled visa. The other common way is through an employer, if you're working with an employer or you have an employer that's willing to sponsor you or nominate you rather for a permanent visa, then that's another pathway that might be available. And it's important to understand that whilst you hold the 485 visa or this 5-year graduate skilled visa, you can apply for permanent residency at any time through that period. You don't have to wait until the end of that 5-year period. In fact, you can't wait until the end because you'll become unlawful, and you definitely can't let that happen. But applying within the 5-year period is perfectly fine. And if you're eligible for the permanent visa, then you simply make the application if and when you're eligible. It's also worth noting that there is some flexibility provided for people who are studying in a regional area. And there is also some advantages studying in a regional area. You are able to claim more points for that independent skilled visa. And there may be some permanent, again, we're not exactly sure what visa is going to be provided for in terms of permanent pathways. What's been announced suggests that there might be greater flexibility for Hong Kongers to meet the criteria for what's called a 491 visa, which is a regional skilled visa, but we're still unclear as exactly what the subclasses are going to be for the permanent visas at the end of all of this. And I think that highlights the problem, because when people come to us and ask us, you know, do I apply for protection or do I apply for my 485 and wait and see what happens? It's a very difficult decision, because if you wait to apply for protection, there might be issues of delay, and the Department of Immigration might be concerned that if you were feared returning in 2020, but you didn't lodge an application for protection until 2022, they might be concerned that you didn't really fear returning. Otherwise, you would have applied when you when you first became aware you might be at risk. And likewise, it's hard to know exactly what the permanent visas will be that are available sort of towards the 4 or 5 year mark from now. So again, there's a bit more work to do, I think, from the Australian government's perspective to really clarify exactly what pathways might be available to people, and then they can make educated decisions about their permanent pathways now.
Similarly of what James was saying, there is the option for Hong Kong passport holders that are currently holders of 485 and 482 visas, which is the employer-sponsored visas, to have an additional 5 years in addition to the time they've already spent in Australia. There are certain criteria to meet with the 485s and the 482 visas.
Sorry, Rabs, that should be 457, not 485.
Oh, all right.
My mistake.
Sorry, that's typo. 457 visa holders. So 457 was the previous 482. A lot of numbers in Australian immigration, but it's basically an employer-sponsored visa. So you have your employer who's sponsoring you for a particular occupation that's on a skilled list, and so the Hong Kong individuals or Hong Kong passport holders are eligible for a further 5 year, provided their occupation is on a skilled list and they meet the labour market testing requirements, which is also quite an intense procedure to go through or process to go through with your employer, and also a number of other criteria. So I think when Hong Kong individuals or individuals from Hong Kong are assessing whether they should go down this route or not, it's really important to again get independent legal advice about whether they meet the criteria for these particular visa categories. Because whilst it's the department have put forward a press release about 5 year visas, it does come with a lot of additional information that you would need a lawyer to assist you with in terms of explaining all of that to you. So our main aim is to educate Hong Kongers, educate individuals or migrants to make sure that they're at least aware of what the requirements are, because it isn't as easy as you'll definitely get a visa for 5 years. You'll get a visa provided you meet other requirements. And then also bouncing off what James has said, whilst the department have said that there are going to be a pathway, or there is going to be a pathway to permanent residence, they've provided not too much transparency about what that actually may be. We have an idea of what permanent residency pathways are in Australia. However, it's unclear, or we don't really know right now what the department has in mind in terms of, are they going to create a new category for Hong Kong passport holders, or are they going to adjust the current permanent residency ones as they've done with temporary visas to include a permanent resident pathway for Hong Kong passport holders?
So just wrapping up those changes, there's changes that have been implemented for 482 and 457 holders to accommodate a further period of stay here in Australia for up to 5 years. The similar concept has been implemented for 485 temporary graduate skilled visa holders. And in October, the independent skilled visa program will open up again, hopefully, fingers crossed, which is the subclass 189 and 190 and 491, which I'm sure many people have got their eye on and familiar with. So we expect to know much more about those programs in October 2020 moving forward, once the Australian budget is released. So that's an exciting time. So there have been some changes that allow for people to stay here longer, but the point of permanency is still unclear, and that's where we really need to advocate around and also consider what other permanent visa options are available. I would just throw in there that there are a couple of other visas that people may want to turn their mind to. One is the global talent program, which is both a independent and employer-sponsored program. It's designed to recruit high-end talent in particular occupations. So for people who might have you know, an internationally recognised set of skills in specific areas, and could secure an income in Australia of above 153,900, which is a nice high income. But if you can demonstrate that you can earn above that in your specific field, it might be worth looking at the global talent stream. That's something to have a think about. And then the other one is for people who are high net wealth individuals. So you might have a history of investment, business innovation and investment in Hong Kong. There is a subclass of visa that's available for investors, which I think for some will be quite attractive. So it's worth turning your mind to those as well. As I said, well, we've been saying a lot of tonight, the changes are good. They don't go far enough. We need to know more. And again, it is really important to get advice about your own circumstances so that you don't do something that might implicate your future visa options. So now we've got time for questions, and we have had some questions submitted to us. If you'd like us to run through them, or if you would like to ask us questions now from the group, we can do that as well.
Yeah, I think I'll just kickstart with a question. We also have friends from Hong Kong International Alliance in Brisbane today as well, so they may have some other questions that they want to ask. So I'll just kickstart with one. So this question is in relation to overstaying with visas. So say if a person arrived in Australia legally, so that person has a visa, but then after a period of time, that visa has expired. Now, the question is that, is applying for the protection visa the only way to remain in Australia lawfully?
That is a good question. And the answer to that would be, as long as you've not been refused a protection visa previously, you can always lodge a protection visa, even if you're unlawful. So that is one way to, you can lodge a valid application. And in that scenario, you would apply for a protection visa and then be granted a bridging visa C, which is a little bit different to a bridging visa A, which is what you would get if you applied for a visa whilst holding a visa. Now, if you're unlawful, it doesn't necessarily mean that a protection visa is the only visa you can apply for. In some cases, you can apply for a partner visa if you're in a relationship with an Australian citizen or permanent resident. In some cases, you can apply for a student visa. So if you were to, if you held a student visa and it lapsed and you're still within 28 days of the expiry date, you can in some cases apply for another student visa. There are also bridging visas that you can apply for if you're unlawful to basically get lawful. They call it regularising your status. So I think the short answer to your question is no, there are other visas, but once you're unlawful, it becomes much more complicated, and there's a number of factors you have to take into account and look at what visas are available.
Thank you, James. That's very helpful. Jeff, I believe you have some questions as well.
Yep. Hey, James. I'm Jack from the Hong Kong International Alliance, Brisbane. Thank you and Rabiah for giving this such wonderful and informative presentation about visas. Just a quick question. If some Hong Kong students, they've graduated from their degree and they've applied for a graduate visa, so they would like to do a master's or like a further study after their graduate visa, would you recommend them to get a study visa or just keep using the graduate visa for the study like given the 5 years could be used for study as well in Australia?
Yeah, that's a bit of a complicated one. Rabiah, you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but if you've applied for so you can only ever hold one 485 visa in your life.
Yeah.
So if you've applied for the 485 and you've not received a decision as yet, and you think, well, look, I actually want to do a master's. I'm thinking of, I've done my bachelor's, I'm thinking of doing a master's. And I might be inclined to think about applying for a new student visa if you're eligible for it, and withdrawing the 485 and doing the 485 visa at the end of the master's, because you actually get a bit longer on the 485 at the end of a master's. And again, like you need the 485 is really designed to give graduates that ability to find employment and sort out their visa and give you that opportunity to get some practical work experience in your field. So you don't necessarily want to be doing that in between a bachelor's and a master's, because if you had the 485 and then you went on to a student visa after that to do a master's, you can't apply for another 485. You're then in a situation where you have to try and do some other type of visa, and it becomes a bit more complicated in that scenario. But yeah, would you agree with that, Rabiah?
Yeah, I agree with that process, but also just very important to note the process in withdrawing and applying for the student visa. Make sure you get help around that, because most people probably would be granted a bridging visa that's inactive associated with the 485 application. And so it gets a bit complicated or a bit complex when you apply for the student visa and then withdraw the 485 visa in terms of the bridging visa associated with that, because you don't want to be withdrawing and then applying and then not really have any bridging visa to apply with or stay lawfully in Australia. So the process is definitely correct. It's just make sure you get assistance with doing that process.
Right, that sounds a bit complicated.
Yeah. I think the problem is if you're withdrawing something and then you find out later, well, actually, I'm not eligible for the student visa, or actually, I want to apply for my 485 again, that becomes really problematic. So I can see where you're coming from, where you're deciding whether you do your 485 now or later. And from a strategy point of view, you probably do it later. It's just a matter of working out the technical visa issues in the meantime to make that work.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I want to ask a question. For example, in the UK, based on the Dublin regulation, and usually those people, if they transit or stay in the EU countries for a while, and they suppose they need to only apply asylum within the first country which they arrive.
Yes.
So some people, they don't understand this regulation, and then they transit through the EU countries into UK, and they may be not eligible to apply. And some people actually, they applied before in United States, Canada, or UK, and then they may come to Australia. Some people, they thought UK would be their transit point, and then they would come to Australia or the third place. I'm not sure in the Australia, would that affect their eligibility or the successful rate to apply the protection visa in Australia?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because what we find generally with Hong Kong nationals is that because of across the board, generally, Hong Kong nationals are fairly skilled and have lived in different countries and worked in different countries. So we see more often people have multiple different visas and at any one time. And from an Australian immigration perspective, if you hold a visa to another country, or you have a right of entry to another country, and you make an application for a protection visa, it can be a real problem, because you've got a legally enforceable right to reside in a third country. So that's from an Australian perspective. If the visa has expired, so say, for example, you went to the States you had a visa there and then you came to Australia and you're here now, and that US visa has since expired and you've applied for protection. In that scenario, it wouldn't immediately be a problem. You might have to explain to the department why you didn't seek protection in the States, and there might be various reasons why you didn't, including, it might not have thought you were at risk in the States, but it wasn't until you got here and everything happened in Hong Kong that you decided that things weren't so good and you wouldn't return. So yeah, you'd need to evaluate the specific case. When it comes to the EU, you're right, it is a complex scenario where you must, generally speaking, apply for protection in the country that you first entered. If you apply for protection in Germany, then your application will be processed in Germany. You can still, my understanding is you can still move throughout Europe, but generally it'll be the protection application in the first country where you applied is where it will be processed. But what I would say is that you, as lawyers, you need to be really careful when giving advice about other jurisdictions, because obviously we're Australian solicitors and not practiced in Europe or in UK. So although the UK is a very similar jurisdiction, those individuals, particularly where you are, should be getting advice from lawyers in the EU, because they'll have a much better idea about those obligations.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, James. The next question is in relation to BNO passports. So I'm sure this one is a burning question for many people. So a lot of Hong Kong BNO passport and the Hong Kong SAR passport. And as the way I understand is that the new regulation applies to Hong Kong SAR passport only. So for example, this person holds a 485 visa using this BNO passport. So under the new regulation, he's wondering whether he'll be granted 5-year extension. And if the answer is no, is there any other suggestion that will allow him to take advantage of the new arrangements?
So that's the ones that have the British national passports, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And are these individuals, do they have Hong Kong passports as well or not?
They have Hong Kong passport and a BNO passport, but then the visa is based on their
BNO passport.
Yeah.
I think this is one we'd need to check. In the legislative instrument, which introduces the changes around the 485s, from memory, the wording is that the person must have held a Hong Kong passport at the time they were granted the visa. So I'm not sure a distinction is made to which passport the visa is linked to. It's more about whether or not at the time it was, granted you had a Hong Kong passport. And I might have to come back to you on that one just to be sure. I think it's a really good question.
I've actually got a friend who's encountered a similar experience, and he managed to change the passport number on his visa into the BNO passport, into the Hong Kong SAR passport he's holding from the BNO passport. So
you can certainly do what's called a notice of change of details to update your passport details with the department, and they'll change the primary passport in that way. I suspect that might have been what that person did.
Yeah, I think it works for him. Yeah. Would that be a possible solution to this?
Well, I think that changes the passport the department has on their system for their references currently. But the way the legislative instrument works about these changes is what passport did you hold at the time you applied for or were granted the visa. So it's probably a matter of looking back at that time and what what passports did you hold. And I'm not sure it's a matter of like which passport you used to apply for the visa, but more did you hold a valid Hong Kong passport at that time? And if you did, then I suspect you'll be able to access those changes, regardless of what passport your visa's linked to. But I would like to probably check that one.
Right. Okay. Thanks, James. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And we have a few questions specifically in relation to protection visa as well. So I think one of our members has a few questions.
Yeah, I can do that. So we have received some question from some Hong Kongers asking about the general information about the protection visa. So one of the question is that what if the protection visa application is refused? Does that person have to leave Australia, and will that affect his or her future application of other kind of visas?
That's a really good question. So if your protection visa is refused, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the road and you have to leave the next day. You do have appeal options to appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for the case to be heard again by an individual member who will pretty much do the same job as what the department has assessed you on. However, it will be considered in a tribunal context. So you will get an opportunity to appear before a tribunal member and discuss your claims and put forward information about certain concerns or issues or the reasons why the department refused the application. It is also important to note that if you are refused a protection visa onshore, if you're refused any visa onshore, it may stop you or hinder your ability to apply for any further visa subclasses in Australia. And that comes up under what the department calls a Section 48B bar, which if you have been refused or cancelled a visa onshore, meaning in Australia, you won't be able to apply for a further visa. There are a couple of exceptions. However, it does limit an individual's ability to apply or stay in Australia if they're looking to apply for another visa.
All right, so what will happen if that person failed to appeal for that protection visa?
If you miss the deadline so say someone received a decision to refuse the protection visa, you would have 28 days to appeal the decision to the AAT for a review of the decision. If you miss that 28-day period, it becomes quite difficult because the only way the AAT doesn't have the power then to look at it, so they can't look at the case again, and you're left with potentially seeking, applying to the High Court is one thing to look at, but it can be very complicated and not always possible, and only in very limited cases is it possible. And then if you can't apply to the High Court to review the decision to refuse the protection visa because there's no legal problems with the way they did it, then you're left with looking at, well, what other visa options do we have? And in that scenario, as Rabiah mentioned, there's some exceptions to the rule, which are if you, the one is a medical treatment visa and the other is a partner visa. There's a few others, but generally speaking, when you've been refused a protection visa and you've missed your appeal deadline, the options become very narrow. And the department will likely start working with that person to talk to them about what their intentions are, and then at some point they will, if they're not eligible for any other visas, then at some point the department will talk to them about returning. There is an international process called individual complaint under the ICCPR, so the United Nations Human Rights Council, Commission rather. So you can You can do an individual complaint. That's international law though, and the Australian government generally, I guess the easiest way to explain it would be that they take advice, but they are a sovereign nation, so they will decide, I guess, themselves whether or not they'll take the advice from the UN.
All right, and so we have another question is that so can a person who is waiting for the results of the protection visa application apply for other kind of visa like the student visa or a temporary skill shortage visa?
That's your one, Rabs. Go on, you can do that one.
You are able to apply for these visas because if you've applied for a protection visa, you'll be granted a bridging visa associated with it. Usually it's a bridging visa A. However, as James has previously mentioned, if you are unlawful at the time or without a visa, you are most likely to be granted a bridging visa C. It will come down to the Schedule 1 requirements of the under the Migration Act about what requirements you are required to meet for that particular visa category. So as a holder of a bridging visa A, you are likely to be eligible to apply. However, again, because a protection visa is a permanent visa that you've applied for, and if you're looking to apply for a temporary visa, you may run into issues with the department putting forward the concerns that you aren't intending to temporarily stay in Australia because you've applied for a permanent protection visa.
All right, and we have a third question from another Hong Konger. So we have an example here. So Tom, a Hong Kong student who is studying in Australia right now, and he has participated in some demonstration here in Australia, and he fears that once he went back to Hong Kong, he will be arrested under the national security law. So he's considering if he should apply for the protection visa. And do you think there is a high possibility for his protection visa to be granted?
Yeah, this is a thing that we're getting asked a lot. So there's a few things to keep in mind here. If you've demonstrated, or if you've done something in Australia and it gives rise to you fearing harm, you need to be really careful that you don't go and do something for the sole purpose of creating a refugee claim. So what I mean by that is if you had someone who had no political opinion, they didn't really care about the political situation, but they thought, oh, look, if I go to this protest and I demonstrate at this protest, it might improve my chances to get a protection visa. The Department of Immigration can actually exclude that from their consideration and say, well, you've done that for the sole purpose of creating a refugee claim. Therefore, we'll exclude it and not look at it. Now, they still need to look at it under a different section, but it becomes an issue of credibility potentially. But what I would say is you need to be careful if you've applied for protection and you're going to go to protests and do those things. I think it's important people express their political opinions and do so freely without the fear of being harmed. But it might be something you just need to have a think about or have a chat to your lawyer about if you're working with a migration agent or lawyer, because it could be something relevant to your case. But to answer your original question, which is, does it give rise or what's the chances? If someone was to demonstrate or participate in a protest here, and the real question is, well, how does that put that person at risk if they go back? How would the authorities know that they've protested? Has it been posted on social media? Has it been put on Facebook? Have they received text messages or emails, or have their families been contacted back in Hong Kong? They're the questions we need to be asking. Simply going to a demonstration and they're not doing anything else, I would say it's going to be difficult to say that immediately makes you a refugee, or you'd be able to apply for protection. But if you are someone who genuinely feels passionately about democracy and Hong Kong and what's happening at the moment, and you are someone who, if you went back, would have a profile, and the authorities might go, well, you've been in Australia and you've been demonstrating, and I've seen your Facebook and you've been saying this, this and this. That's a problem. And really what the Department of Immigration will be doing is they'll be looking at what you've said is an issue and then going, well, what's the reports? What are the journalists saying? What are the organisations like Human Rights Watch and the United Nations saying about what's happening in Hong Kong? And if that matches up and we can say, well, it might be the case that someone has just attended one protest and that's all they've done, and that might be enough to meet the definition of a refugee. It all depends on what the response is and what the reports are coming out of Hong Kong. So that is a difficult thing to advise on without knowing more about the person's case. But the other thing I will say is that the definition of a refugee and the protection visa criteria, it's a forward-looking test. It looks at what you've done in the past, but the decision is what's going to happen to you in the future. So it's not only about what you've done, but what you might do if you go back. And if you're someone that's been involved in groups like this and promoted the idea of democracy and potentially might be seen as someone who's anti, CCP or whatever it is, it's about what might happen to you in the future that's important.
And that's why it's really important to provide a really good statement outlining a lot of detail about your beliefs, your profile, what you've done and why you've done it. It's not going to be satisfactory enough just to say I went to a protest because I believe in democracy and that's it. It really requires a lot of detail and a lot of explaining to the department to link the certain aspects of what you're going to be tested on or evaluated on for a protection visa.
Thank you, James and Rabiah. I'm conscious of time, so I might just ask two last questions and then wrap up with the seminar. So this one is in relation to 4H2 visas. So it's a question that we've been asked quite a lot. So under the 4H2 conditions, there are employer sponsor requirement. So the question is, are the applicants required to have the same employer for the whole 5 years, or are they allowed to switch employers?
Yeah, I think this one's where someone holds a 482 or a 457 is the older version. So with that visa, the business nominates someone and there's a condition on that visa. Whilst you're nominated with the business, you must only work for that business or an associated entity of that business. Now, if you, for whatever reason, it might be you've been made redundant because of COVID, or you've got a better opportunity somewhere else, or whatever it is, if you want to move to a new employer, the process you go through, generally speaking, is what's called a nomination transfer, and that's where you transfer the nomination to the new business. It may not be, well, there may be no need to reapply for the visa, because the visa sometimes can be valid for, well, will be in this case for 5 years potentially. So you don't need to renew it unless you're coming up to your sort of renewal date. But yeah, you generally would do a nomination transfer. And the key thing is you can't start working for the new business until the nomination's been approved. So you don't want to breach that condition that you have. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, James. I think, yeah, it's a very comprehensive answer. So the last one I have is in relation to protection visa. Now, you mentioned you should have supporting evidence and any information that you have about like why you're having genuine fear of being persecuted. So our question here is whether, for example, a support letter from an NGO or even like MPs in Australia would help with the application.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rabi could probably talk about this as well, but my view is if you've been associated with or been participating in any groups, whether they, NGOs or community groups like this, and if those groups can evidence your involvement, which is also evidence of your political opinion as well, potentially, those letters of support will be really important. And in protection visa cases, in some cases, you can have a witness. So if there's someone who has been granted protection here who might be a senior member of a group that you're a part of, and they're willing to provide a testimony or provide evidence on your behalf about your involvement and why they think you would be at risk, that's something we've done in the past before. So that's something to have a think about as well.
Yeah, definitely what James has summed up pretty well. It does form a witness or a statement from someone who in the community who's aware of your activities or aware of your profile, or that can provide written evidence that yes, this person's part of this organisation, they've participated in a number of activities. That actually forms really important evidence in part in an individual's protection application that the department does rely on, provided it's in relation to your claims and supporting the claims that you're putting forward.
Sorry, just one quick last question. Is there any chance that if some Hong Kongers would like to come to Australia to seek protection right now at this moment, how likely is there any chance that they could get a compassionate visa maybe to come to Australia and seek protection?
That's a hard one at the moment with the travel restrictions, because the ability to get into Australia at the moment is really quite hard because of COVID, and you need a visa to enter first. What I would say is that the offshore humanitarian program is largely managed through the UNHCR. So if you come through the UNHCR and then referred to the Australian government, then there are a class of offshore humanitarian visas. It's very hard for those who are in Hong Kong at the moment, and you can apply for a visa still. So if you're eligible for an employee-sponsored visa or a student visa, or you can still make the application. But if you, for example, were applying for a tourist visa to come to Australia, and you said, I'm coming to Australia because I'm a refugee and I fear harm, you don't meet the genuine temporary entrant criteria for the visa. So it becomes quite complex for those people who are in Hong Kong trying to get out. And there's not really, I think for a solicitor, there's not much we can really say about that, apart from we recommend that you try and get to the UNHCR or contact the Red Cross is another organisation that might be able to help.
Right, okay. Thanks, James.
Thanks, James and Rabiah. If there are no further burning questions, then I might wrap up the webinar here. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. And once again, I thank our guests from WLW Lawyers for the very informative session. I hope you found this very useful. As always, the decision to settle in another country is a very big one. And it's very important that you seek trustworthy independent migration advice and be informed about before you make that big decision. So our organization will continue to organize helpful events and activities to support Hong Kongers, so stay tuned to our page. And I believe Haven Assistance is organizing a few more sessions in other countries. So would you like to let the audience know what's coming up next? Simon?
Yeah. Thanks again for James and Rabiah and Australia Hong Kong Link for co-organizing, and actually it's mainly organized this event. Very informative, and I learned a lot, and I'm very excited, and I'm very grateful for all of your help and effort to help Hong Kong people. And in the future, as I mentioned, we will promote this event, and we will have posters and in English and in Chinese, and we would promote it on our Facebook page And I talked with Jen as well that we will also simultaneously to post it on our Facebook page to let more people to know. And then afterwards, almost per week, and we will have one theme for each country. First of all, it would be like Five Eyes Alliance would be the most important, and I guess Hong Kong people would be interested the most, and of course Taiwan as well. So I would issue the more details lately. I'm scheduling this itinerary with Ray Wong, and of course that Brian Leung and Lau Ming Gay was also supporting us. So I hope that all of us can keep an eye on us, and I'm thank you for your all support. Thank you.